On our wedding day, my Uncle Gerald stood up, drunk and rambling, shouting that Sarah didn't love me. I laughed him off. He stumbled out, humiliated. Months later, I found the messages. Sarah's affair, her lies. Gerald had tried to warn me. That day shattered every illusion. Now, Sarah's name is poison, and Gerald is the only one who never truly left my side. Sarah and I had this weekend ritual coffee. Old Jazz silent smiles. She loved it, or so I thought. Then she started skipping Saturdays, claiming work. One morning I found a cologne scent on her scarf. She laughed it off. I believed her. Uncle Gerald made a joke about secrets slipping through seams. I brushed it off, not realizing that was the crack in our carefully curated life together. Sarah once surprised me with a trip to Denver. It felt spontaneous. Romantics, but on the second night, she vanished for hours. Said she got lost looking for wine. I believed her again. Gerald later mentioned seeing her with someone else, but I snapped at him for meddling. Looking back, that was the moment I chose fantasy over facts. And Sarah, she counted on my trust to keep her secrets safe. Sarah started locking her phone privacy, she claimed, smiling sweetly. I nodded, pretending it didn't bother me. One night I saw a text pop up. Can't wait to see you. She snatched the phone, said it was a coworker's joke. I smiled, but inside, something cracked. Gerald watched me closely that week. I told him to back off, but his eyes said it all. He knew what I didn't want to admit. Beth, Gerald's girlfriend, pulled me aside one afternoon. She's hiding something, she said gently. I brushed her off, feeling cornered. That night, Sarah came home late, makeup smudged, hair tousled. She claimed a work crisis. I nodded. Beth texted me later, you deserve better. I stared at the screen for an hour. Doubt now had a voice, hers, and once I heard it, silence from Sarah started screaming the truth. Sarah forgot to sign out of her email on my laptop. Curiosity turned into cold sweat, flirty exchanges, hotel receipts, a thread labeled Plan B. I slammed the laptop shut, heart racing. That weekend, Gerald invited me for a drink. I declined. He just nodded. He'd stopped trying, and that said more than words ever could. I weren't ready for the truth, but it had already made itself at home. Sarah planned a dinner for our anniversary. Candlelight, wine, her favorite music, but her eyes never met mine. Midway, I joked, anyone else joining us? She flinched, laughed too loud. I knew then this wasn't celebration, it was performance. That night, I walked into Gerald's den. He didn't say anything, just slid a photo across the table. Sarah, holding hands with someone. My stomach turned, so did the tide. I confronted Sarah, holding the photo. Her face went pale, then twisted with rage. You've been spying on me, she hissed. I didn't back down. She threw the frame off the mantel, glass shattered, like the trust between us. Gerald stepped in, calm but firm. He deserves truth, he said. Sarah stormed out. That night, I slept on Gerald's couch, not because I had to but because I finally chose to stop pretending. I packed Sarah's things while she screamed in the hallway. Her insults bounced off the walls. But I stayed quiet. Gerald waited by the door, silent support. As I closed the final suitcase, she hurled her wedding ring at me. It hit the floor with a metallic thud. You'll regret this, she spat. I didn't reply. Gerald placed a hand on my shoulder. That moment, no words, just presence became my turning point. In court, Sarah painted me as controlling. Her lawyer spun lies with polished smiles. I sat still, fists clenched beneath the table. Gerald testified, voice steady, recounting the photo, the lies. Beth sat beside me, offering a quiet nod. The judge looked at me not with pity, but clarity. That hearing wasn't just about divorce, it was my liberation. I walked out with half of everything, but it felt like I'd regained something far greater, myself. The day after court, Sarah left a voicemail sobbing, apologizing, begging to talk. I deleted it. Gerald found me staring at the wall later. Regret is her new game, he said. I nodded. He handed me a paintbrush, like an offering. Start here. I dipped it in crimson, then pressed it to the canvas. No plan, no meaning. Just motion. It felt like breathing for the time in months. Beth and Gerald took me to a gallery opening. I almost refused, but something in Beth's smile changed my mind. The place buzzed with voices, clinking glasses. One painting, bold strokes, chaotic beauty, stopped me cold. The artist's note read, painted after letting go. My chest tightened. Beth whispered, you'll get there. I believed her. That night, I sketched for the time in years, not to escape but to feel again. Sarah showed up uninvited at my art show. Her eyes were puffy. Dressed too perfect. Can we talk? She whispered. I shook my head. There's nothing left. She stepped back, eyes wet, lips trembling. Gerald stood nearby, watching. Sarah turned and vanished into the crowd. I turned back to the canvas, a storm I'd painted. It no longer looked violent. It looked honest. That moment, I knew I'd truly begun to heal. After the show, Gerald handed me a letter. From Beth, he said. Inside were Sarah's threats, emails where she blackmailed Beth about being transgender. My stomach dropped. Gerald had endured my rejection to protect someone he loved. I looked at him, his quiet strength, his unwavering patience. I'm sorry, I whispered. He nodded. Forgiveness had always been his default. That night, I couldn't sleep. My heart ached, but not for Sarah, only for wasted time. I took the emails to my lawyer. He stared, then whistled low. This could open a whole new case. Gerald hesitated, fearing more pain for Beth. But she stepped forward, voice clear. She can't hurt anyone else. We filed a formal complaint. Days later, Sarah's employer suspended her. Her image, curated and cold, began to unravel. I watched it all unfold, not with vengeance, but with relief. The truth, finally freed, started carving new space for all of us. Gerald showed me a journal he'd kept, pages filled with dates, observations, everything he'd noticed about Sarah over the years. I didn't know how to help without proof, he said. It was meticulous, heartbreaking. I flipped through entries. Sarah lied about fundraiser. Beth crying in guest room. His quiet watchfulness had become a lifeline I never saw forming. I hugged him tight. Overdue. Gerald had been documenting not just lies, but his hope that I'd one day see. Beth received an anonymous message threatening, cruel, clearly Sarah's style. We took it to the police. They traced it back to a burner phone in Sarah's name. It was the final nail. Charges were filed: harassment, discrimination. Gerald held Beth's hand as she gave her statement. I stood beside them, proud, not because we'd won, but because we stood firm. For once, Sarah's power couldn't hide behind charm or deceit. The law saw her now clearly. Fully justly, an old friend of Sarah's came forward unprompted. She had recordings, voice notes of Sarah bragging about manipulating me, mocking Beth's identity, even laughing at Gerald's stutter. Hearing them made my stomach turn. The friend said, I thought she was funny. Now I know she's cruel. That testimony added weight to the charges. Sarah's mask wasn't just cracked, it shattered. And behind it was a woman wronged, but a woman who had done deep calculated harm. One morning, I found Beth crying, not out of fear but gratitude. You believed me, she whispered. I'd always assumed she was strong, and she was, but even strength needs support. Gerald wrapped his arms around her. I joined them. We weren't just survivors of Sarah's manipulation. We were rebuilding something truer. Love doesn't fix brokennesses, but it creates space where healing isn't punished. That morning, I stopped mourning my past and started investing in our future. Sarah's trial began on a rainy Monday. I watched her sit in silence, hair pulled tight, no allies left. Beth testified, calm, unwavering. Then Gerald's eyes steady. When my turn came, I breathed deep and spoke plainly: the lies, the gaslighting, the erosion of trust. The jury's faces stayed stoic, but I saw something crack in Sarah's stare: panic. Her control was gone. In that courtroom, truth didn't just surface, it took root. The verdict arrived guilty on harassment, discrimination, and emotional abuse. Sarah broke down, not in remorse, but in disbelief. She never thought consequences would catch up. The courtroom didn't cheer, didn't clap, just silence. But for us, that quiet was justice. Gerald squeezed Beth's hand. I exhaled, a breath I didn't know I'd been holding for years. For once, Sarah's story ended on someone else's terms, and our story finally got to begin. After the trial, I moved in with Gerald and Beth temporarily. The house felt different, warmer, filled with quiet trust. We cooked together, shared long talks, and sometimes just sat in peaceful silence. One evening, Beth asked if I'd ever paint our story. I hesitated. Too raw, I said. Gerald chimed in. Raw is honest. That night, I began sketching, not to expose Sarah but to honor the people who never stopped holding space for my truth. Gerald got a call from an old college friend and art gallery owner. I've heard about your nephew, he said. Tell him I want his story on my walls. I was stunned. To me, a gallery. Gerald just grinned. Told you people would listen. For the time, my pain wasn't something to hide, it was something that could connect. Inspire. I painted every night. Brushes soaked in memory, strokes echoing survival. My truth was finally on canvas. Opening night arrived. My work, raw, imperfect, honest, lined the gallery walls. Strangers lingered, reading titles like Silence Isn't Consent and Unseen Bruises. Death wept quietly. Gerald stood tall beside her. I spotted a young couple holding hands, whispering, nodding. One said, This is what healing looks like. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply stood there, letting their reactions wrap around me. That night, I wasn't just a survivor, I was a storyteller. Weeks later, I got a message from Sarah's old therapist, anonymous, but unmistakably real. She manipulated every session. You were never the problem. It was oddly comforting. Even professionals had been misled. And now the truth trickled out from corners I never imagined. I didn't share the message with anyone. It was a quiet gift, tucked in my inbox like closure in a digital envelope. Sometimes, healing shows up in the most unexpected acknowledgements. A podcast invited me to share my story. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to be that open, but Gerald said, Your truth doesn't shrink just because it's public. Beth squeezed my hand. I recorded the episode in one breath, no edits, no polish, just honesty. When it aired, messages flooded in, people thanking me, sharing their pain, their freedom. My voice didn't echo into silence, it reached others, and in doing so, it reached me too. One night, I dreamed of Sarah, not in pain or rage, but distant, like smoke. I woke up calm. It wasn't forgiveness, it was release. Gerald and Beth were already up, making breakfast. I joined them, heart light. That morning, we framed one of my paintings together, The Quiet Exit. Gerald smiled. That's not about her, is it? I shook my head. No, it's about what comes after. Healing, it turned out, wasn't a finish line, it was daily. Beth's art class invited me to speak. I walked in, expecting polite smiles. What I found were eyes wide with curiosity, notebooks open, questions burning. I talked about pain, survival, and the alchemy of turning hurt into color. A teenager raised her hand, voice shaking. Does it ever stop hurting? I paused. Not always, but it changes and it stops owning you. That day, I realized stories don't just heal us, they heal those still bleeding. Gerald proposed to Beth under the same tree where we once scattered his dog's ashes. It was quiet, intimate, full of grace. Beth said yes through tears afterward. Gerald pulled me aside. She saved me, he whispered. I smiled. You saved me. We hugged, the kind that collapses years of pain into a single breath. We had all come from broken ends. But we didn't stay there. Love hadn't just returned, it had been reborn in all of us. At Gerald and Beth's wedding, I gave the toast. I spoke of art and honesty, of broken things becoming beautiful. This isn't about escape, I said, raising my glass. It's about arrival. Beth beamed. Gerald nodded. The guests clapped. But it wasn't noise, it was affirmation. That night, I stood alone under string lights, breath visible in the cool air. My life hadn't ended with Sarah. It had only just begun with family I hadn't known I needed. After everything, I found peace not in forgetting but in understanding. I painted every day, not for galleries, but for myself. Each brushstroke whispered a truth I once feared. Gerald and Beth became more than family, they were my foundation. I looked at old photos without flinching. Spoke my story without trembling. Pain hadn't vanished, it had transformed. Now when I close my eyes, I don't see betrayal. I see color, honesty, and a life I finally chose. Years later, I opened a community art center. Gerald cut the ribbon. Beth baked cookies. We called it Second Strokes. Survivors came in of abuse, grief, silence. They painted, sculpted, wrote. One woman whispered, "Your story saved me." I didn't cry, I thanked her. Sarah, last I heard, moved away. No job, no name left untouched. I didn't need revenge. I had purpose, I had love, I had a space that turned pain into beauty. And that was everything.